Most believe that without sexual expression, the body withers and the soul empties. But what if conscious celibacy could amplify both? What if the energy you've been releasing outward has been the key to unlocking something far more powerful? Within your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes. These words from Carl Jung aren't just philosophy. They're a map back to yourself. And if you continue avoiding this truth, you'll keep mistaking hunger for love, impulse for choice. You know that restless feeling when the familiar outlet disappears. Belle had been sexually active since college. For 15 years, it was her escape, her validation, her way of feeling alive. But after her last relationship ended in emotional exhaustion, something inside her whispered stop. The first weeks were jarring. Her body felt like a live wire with nowhere to discharge. Intrusive fantasies invaded her meditation. Sleep became elusive. Every movie, every song, every conversation seemed to pulse with what she was denying herself. But beneath the physical discomfort, something else was stirring. A question she'd never had the stillness to hear. Who am I when I'm not performing desire? This is where most people turn back. They interpret the discomfort as evidence they're doing something wrong. They don't realize they're standing at the threshold of their own Carl Jung shadow. All the energy they've been projecting outward finally turning inward to illuminate what's been hidden. The urges aren't the enemy. They're messengers carrying information about unmet emotional needs you've been too busy to notice. If you're feeling this pull towards stillness, towards something deeper than physical release, trust it. Your soul is trying to tell you something. Here's where the real battle begins. Not against your body, but against the voices that tell you who you should be. Your persona, that carefully crafted version of yourself that performs normalcy, starts to panic. It whispers, you should be sexually active to be normal, desirable, complete. People will think something's wrong with you. You're missing out. You're wasting your youth. But underneath your deeper self is calling for something else entirely. It needs stillness to face what you've avoided for years. It needs space to examine the patterns you've been repeating, the wounds you've been numbing, the authentic desires you've buried beneath societal expectations. Brian discovered this split at 32. A successful architect who had built his identity around being the charming, sexually confident guy everyone wanted to be around. But after each encounter, he felt emptier, more disconnected from himself. When he chose celibacy, his friends couldn't understand it. You're in your prime, they said. Why would you give that up? What they couldn't see was that Brian wasn't giving anything up. He was reclaiming something. The same energy that had been flowing outward in desperate attempts to feel worthy was now available for a different kind of creation. Think of desire as a powerful river. Most of us let it flood outward in all directions, chaotic, unfocused, leaving us drained. But what happens when you redirect that river inward? It carves out depth. It creates resilience. It transforms the landscape of your inner world. This isn't repression. Repression is built on fear and shame. This is transmutation, the alchemical process of taking raw energy and refining it into something more valuable. Carl Jung understood this deeply. He wrote about the transcendent function, the ability to hold tension between opposites until something new emerges. Sexual energy doesn't disappear when you stop expressing it sexually. It transforms. You call it sacrifice. But maybe it's the most generous thing you could do for yourself. Your body isn't betraying you when it feels this tension. It's asking you to listen. not to the culture that profits from your restlessness, but to the quiet wisdom that emerges when you stop running from yourself. The split becomes visible in small moments. You'll be watching a movie, and instead of being pulled into the sexual tension on screen, you'll notice how it's being used to sell you something. You'll see how much of popular culture depends on keeping you in a state of unconscious hunger. You'll realize that your sexual desires were often not about pleasure at all, but about trying to fill holes that sex could never actually fill. This awareness can be disorienting. For years, you've been told that sexual expression is health freedom, self-actualization. Now you're discovering that for you in this season of your life, sexual restraint might be the path to those same things. Your persona fights this realization because it threatens the story you've been telling about yourself. But your soul recognizes truth when it hears it. Some of you are feeling this right now, that pull between what you think you should want and what your soul is actually asking for. That's not confusion. That's the beginning of clarity. That's your authentic self trying to emerge from beneath the layers of conditioning and expectation. The voices will get louder before they get quieter. Society has a vested interest in keeping you seeking outside yourself. But every time you choose stillness over stimulation, observation over action, you strengthen the part of yourself that knows what's true. You're not becoming less human. You're becoming more yourself. Here's the insight that changes everything. Repression and transformation are not the same thing. Repression says, "This energy is bad. I must push it away." Transformation says, "This energy is powerful. How can I work with it?" When Belle stopped fighting her desires and started observing them, something remarkable happened. She noticed that her sexual urges often peaked when she felt anxious, lonely, or disconnected from her purpose. Sex hadn't been about pleasure. It had been her way of avoiding difficult emotions. For the first time in years, she had to sit with those feelings directly. The anxiety didn't kill her. The loneliness revealed itself as a hunger for authentic connection, not just physical contact. The disconnection from purpose became an invitation to remember what she actually cared about. This is shadow work in its purest form. Carl Jung knew that we can't heal what we won't face. Every urge you've been unconsciously fulfilling has been carrying information about your psyche. Information you can only receive when you create space between impulse and action. Your sexual desires aren't random biological drives. They're messengers carrying intelligence about your emotional state, your unmet needs, your unconscious fears and longings. Your body begins to recalibrate. Hormones that had been spiking and crashing start to find balance. The dopamine hits you'd been chasing through sexual validation are replaced by the steady satisfaction of inner work. Your nervous system, no longer constantly activated by the chase, settles into a rhythm you'd forgotten was possible. But this process isn't linear. Some days you'll feel like you're floating clear and grounded and impossibly present. Other days you'll feel like you're crawling out of your skin, every nerve ending asking for the familiar release. The most profound shift happens in your relationship with yourself. You stop seeking external validation for your worth. You stop equating your value with your desirability. You discover that your magnetic presence doesn't come from sexual energy. It comes from self-possession. This is what Jung meant when he wrote about individuation, the process of becoming a complete, integrated person rather than a collection of unconscious reactions and social performances. Brian found this out when he realized people were drawn to him differently, not because he was performing sexual confidence, but because he had stopped performing altogether. There's something irresistible about someone who knows themselves, who isn't constantly looking outside for proof of their worth. His architecture improved. His friendships deepened. His family relationships became more honest. When you're not bleeding energy through unconscious sexual seeking, you have so much more available for everything else. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Jung's words echo through this process. The darkness isn't your desire, it's your unconscious relationship with it. For years, maybe decades, you've been driven by forces you didn't understand, patterns you didn't recognize, needs you couldn't name. Sexual expression for many people becomes a way to avoid this deeper work. Not because sex is bad, but because it can become another form of spiritual bypassing. When you bring consciousness to sexual energy instead of simply expressing it, you gain access to its creative potential. Artists have known this for centuries. Monks and mystics have built entire traditions around it. It's not about denying life force, it's about becoming a more skilled conductor of it. You start to understand that sexual energy is just one manifestation of the fundamental creative force that moves through all of life. You begin to see how much of your sexual activity had been unconscious, driven by loneliness, boredom, anxiety, the need to prove something to yourself or others. When you remove that outlet, all of these underlying emotions rise to the surface. This can be uncomfortable, but it's also profoundly clarifying. You're finally meeting yourself without the buffer of sexual distraction. The stillness reveals what movement had been hiding. Without the constant noise of sexual seeking, you hear the subtle voice of your authentic self, the one that's been waiting patiently for you to stop running long enough to listen. This voice has opinions about your career, your relationships, your creative work, your spiritual path. It's been there all along, but you've been too busy seeking to hear it. This isn't about becoming perfect or pure. It's about becoming whole. And wholeness includes your sexuality, your desires, your very human needs. But now, you're the one choosing how to express them rather than being unconsciously driven by them. You're moving from reaction to response, from compulsion to choice. Some of you are recognizing yourselves in this process. You've felt that exhaustion of always seeking outside yourself for what can only be found within. Trust that fatigue. It's your soul's way of saying it's time to come home. The Carl Jung shadow that you've been running from contains not just your rejected desires, but also your rejected power, creativity, and wisdom. The transformation isn't just personal, it's relational. When you stop using other people's bodies to avoid your own depths, you can actually see them, meet them, love them for who they are rather than what they provide. Your relationships become less needy, more generous, less about what you can get and more about what you can give. This is where wisdom becomes practice, where insight transforms into daily reality. Learning to master sexual energy isn't about conquering it, it's about partnering with it. Like taming a wild horse, you're not breaking its spirit. You're teaching it to carry you where you actually want to go. Belle developed a morning ritual. When she felt sexual tension rising, instead of immediately seeking release, she would breathe into it. Not to make it go away, but to feel its full power without being controlled by it. She learned to ask, what is this energy trying to tell me? What do I really need right now? Sometimes the answer was connection, but not the quick hit of physical intimacy. She needed to call a friend, write in her journal, or simply sit with herself without distraction. Sometimes it was creative expression. The same energy that might have driven her toward sexual encounter now flowed into her painting, her writing, her work. Movement became sacred. When the energy felt too intense to simply observe, she would dance, run, practice yoga, not to exhaust herself into numbness, but to give the life force a conscious direction. Your body needs to move this energy through. The question is whether you're moving it unconsciously or with intention. The physical practices that support this transformation aren't about punishment or denial. They're about learning to work skillfully with your own energy system. Brian discovered breathwork, simple techniques that shifted his nervous system from arousal to calm alertness. 4 counts in hold for 4, out for 6. When practiced consistently, this taught his body that he could experience intensity without immediately acting on it. Cold showers became a form of nervous system training. Meditation revealed the difference between desire and the awareness that observes desire. This is the beginning of true freedom, when you can feel desire without being compelled by it, when you can acknowledge arousal without being enslaved to it. You're not trying to become a monk or a saint. You're learning to become the conscious director of your own life force. The same energy that creates babies also creates art, builds businesses, heals relationships, and transforms consciousness. The Carl Jung shadow that once controlled you from the unconscious now becomes your ally. You're no longer fighting against parts of yourself. You're integrating them, working with them, learning their language. The sexual urges don't disappear, but they become information rather than commandments. They tell you about your emotional state, your need for connection, your creative energy levels. Your relationship with others transforms too. Without the constant undercurrent of sexual seeking, you can see people more clearly. You're not unconsciously scanning for validation, for conquest, for escape from yourself. You can be present with what actually is, rather than what you hope to get. This doesn't mean you become asexual or lose interest in romance. It means you approach these areas of life from wholeness rather than lack. The practices that support this transformation are simple but not easy. Daily meditation, even just 10 minutes, teaches you to observe your thoughts and sensations without immediately reacting. Physical exercise becomes a way to move stagnant energy and build confidence in your body's capacity for strength and endurance. Creative work, writing, art, music, building something with your hands gives sexual energy a constructive outlet. Journaling reveals patterns you might not otherwise notice. When do the urges peak? What emotional states trigger them? What are you really seeking in those moments? Over time, you develop a relationship with your desires rather than being unconsciously controlled by them. You learn to see them as valuable information about your inner landscape. This doesn't mean you'll never be sexual again. Many who walk this path discover that when they do choose sexual expression, it comes from wholeness rather than lack, from choice rather than compulsion. The experience becomes richer, more conscious, more connected. But for now, in this season of your life, something else is calling. Trust the process. Trust the discomfort. Trust the way your body is learning to hold energy differently. You're not becoming less human, you're becoming more yourself. The culture will tell you that sexual restraint is repression, but you're discovering that conscious choice is the highest form of freedom. Something profound happens when you stop seeking yourself in others' bodies. You remember who you were before you learned to perform desire. Belle began to notice her own presence differently. Walking into rooms, she wasn't unconsciously scanning for sexual validation or romantic possibility. She was simply there, grounded in her own being. People responded to this differently, not because she was less attractive, but because her energy was no longer scattered in 1,000 seeking directions. This is individuation in action. Carl Jung's term for the process of becoming who you truly are, rather than who you think you should be. Sexual energy, when redirected inward, becomes the fuel for this deep work of self-discovery. You stop asking, "How can I be more desirable?" and start asking, "How can I be more myself?" The difference is revolutionary. Your identity stops being defined by external performance and starts being anchored in internal truth. You're not the person you think you need to be loved. You're not the persona you've crafted to avoid rejection. You're the authentic self that emerges when you stop running from your own depths. This self has preferences that don't depend on others' approval. It has desires that aren't driven by lack. It has a presence that doesn't need to perform. Brian found that his creativity exploded. The energy that had been cycling through sexual encounters was now available for his architecture, his art, his writing. But more than that, his presence became magnetic in a completely different way. He wasn't trying to be attractive, he was simply fully himself. And that self-possession drew people like a magnet. Clients wanted to work with him. Friends sought his counsel. Family members felt safer being honest with him. Your relationship patterns shift. You stop accepting crumbs of affection because you're no longer starving for validation. You stop trying to fill emotional voids through physical connection. You discover that the wholeness you were seeking through others was always available within yourself. This doesn't make you cold or disconnected. If anything, it makes you more capable of real intimacy. When you're not desperately seeking completion through another person, you can actually see them meet them, love them for who they are rather than what they provide. Your love becomes less needy, more generous. Your presence becomes less demanding, more nourishing. You offer yourself to relationships from fullness rather than emptiness. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Jung knew that this becoming requires us to withdraw our projections to stop seeking outside ourselves what can only be found within. Sexual energy used unconsciously keeps us in the seeking. Used consciously, it becomes the very force that carries us home to ourselves. You begin to trust your inner guidance more than cultural pressures. You start making decisions based on what feels true rather than what looks good. You stop betraying yourself for acceptance and start accepting yourself despite others' opinions. This shift ripples out into every area of your life. Career choices become more authentic. Friendships become more honest. Family relationships become less reactive. The return doesn't happen all at once. It's a gradual remembering, like slowly turning up the lights in a room you thought was empty, only to discover it was furnished all along. You remember that you used to paint before you became obsessed with dating. You remember that you used to love solitary walks before you needed constant connection. You remember dreams you abandoned when you decided being desirable was more important than being yourself. This isn't nostalgia for a simpler time. It's integration of all your parts, the sexual being, the creative being, the spiritual being, the professional being. But now these aspects of yourself are working together rather than competing for energy. Your sexuality doesn't disappear. It becomes one instrument in the orchestra of your life rather than the only song you know how to play. What could you create, heal, or become if you were no longer ruled by your urges? This isn't a question about perfection. It's an invitation to examine where your energy is going and whether that's where you want it to flow. Tonight before you sleep, ask yourself, what am I really hungry for? Not what your culture tells you to want, not what your past patterns have programmed you to seek, but what your soul is actually asking for. Journal on this. Meditate on it. Sit with the possibility that stillness isn't emptiness, it's the quiet, unshakable source of power you've been seeking outside yourself. The moment you stop performing desire is the moment you start embodying it, not as need, but as choice, not as desperation, but as creative force. If this resonates, trust it. Your shadow is calling you home.